Good evening. Welcome to our session on childhood in 513. I hope you all are enjoying the fall weather. It is pretty fabulous in Nashville, so I hope wherever you are, it is beautiful. So this unit, I'm going to jump right into it, and what our plan for this evening is I'm going to go over a number of different slides, probably for about 20 or 30 minutes or so. Definitely want to engage with you all, so please unmute your line and ask me a question if you have it, or I'll try to keep an eye on the chat room. So we're going to do that, and then I'm going to dive into the CTEs, because as you all know, they are due this evening, and hopefully they are completed, and I want to make sure that you have some good time for questions and discussion, as well as I'd really like to hear from each of you all about what some of your thoughts are about the CTE. It was a little bit different than the last one, and just want to make sure you all feel really good about moving forward and getting into all of that. So a couple of just little housekeeping thoughts about the CTE. I've had some questions from students about is it okay for you to cite the textbook? Absolutely, you can cite the textbook. There are two required chapters for this unit, so that makes sense. You may have seen it in the instructions in a few places where it says, don't cite textbooks, and that's an error on my part, that it's from a different course, from an earlier course of 513, where that was part of the instructions, but it's not applicable to you all. So I apologize for any confusion around that. Let's see if there's any other little things. Overall, I think I said this in the email, I was really impressed with your initial CTEs. They were very, very, very good. I think I gave out only 2 10s across all my 70 plus students, and one of those was one of you all. So very proud of you all for doing a fabulous job. And really some great writing, some great critical thinking. And so you really have another opportunity for being creative in this next CTE. Anytime you think about a training program, there's a whole host of opportunities for you all to consider. So you all can be creative. You can also definitely pull resources and information from earlier units. So if you're finding that all of the readings are not kind of covering all the bases that you want to cover in this CTE, feel free to pull from the trauma unit or anything like that. One final thing about the CTE, in case I forget to mention it, is you have probably noticed that there was not a specific age of the child, and because this unit covers early childhood and middle childhood, you really have an option to talk about what those behaviors could look like at different developmental stages, should you so choose, or you can kind of focus in on one thing. Again, you all can be creative. There's not necessarily, because I didn't give you specific information, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do that, as long as you're covering as many of the concepts and vocabulary from this unit as possible. So I'm going to pause for just a moment and check in with you all to see if there's any initial questions. I hear somebody is unmuted, so I don't know if that means you have a question, but I'll just pause for a moment and see if there's any questions before we get started into the material. Okay. Well, I have a question for you all. Were you able to okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to pull up the PowerPoints. I'm assuming because I posted all of the videos and you all are pretty used to looking at those on your own. Were there any issues with any of the videos this time around? I saw one on one of the developmental theories, one around Vygotsky that came up that I wasn't anticipating, but were there any issues with those? is one question. And then another question is, did you all watch all of the videos that were in Dr. Terry Combs-Orm's lecture that I posted? I did not post those videos separately, but there were many, many, many videos that were embedded in her lecture. And I just wanted to check in because I may show one or two of those videos tonight while we're together, if a large portion of you did not figure out that there were actually videos embedded in there. Some of them are kind of obvious, but some of them, depending on how you looked at it, you may have not been able to see. Anybody? There's 14 of you all on now. Anybody want to volunteer if you were able to see those videos?
I saw all the videos.
I'm sorry?
I said I saw all the videos actually in the PowerPoint slide.
Yes.
I was able to watch every one of them.
Oh, you did? Okay, good. All right. Okay. I just wanted, because sometimes I found out that y'all are looking, some of y'all may be looking at this on the Blackboard app, which hopefully you're not, but you miss a lot of stuff if you look at this course site on the app. But just wanted to point that out to you. Okay, since I've heard from at least one of you that you were able to watch it, I will assume that you are not the only one. If you have not done that, please take a look at some of those videos. A lot of them are really short. They're only 2 minutes. Either, just kind of before you close out this unit. I mean, all of them are kind of, relevant in some way to the CTE. I'll probably just show one brief one, but if you haven't watched them, they're really great. And also, many of the videos that are embedded in there come from the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard University, which is where Shonkoff is, and we've read several of his articles at this point, and I'm sure, and he's certainly been referenced throughout our time in this course. So it's a wonderful resource if you have not seen that and you're interested in learning more information about brain architecture and neglect and abuse and how all of that affects child development. So great resource. Okay, well, I'm going to jump right in to the to some slides. And again, I want you all to be as let's see. Hopefully you all can see this. So I'd like for you all to please jump in if you have any questions, and we'll just be going through this little by little. And let's see if I can do this. Okay. So one of the critical things for this unit, and this is related to the CTE question, which really that's an opportunity for us to frame our discussion tonight. And it really is important to look at different aspects of development from a theoretical perspective. We're not going to spend a lot of time on theories, but please don't take that to mean that they're not important. There is a huge amount of information on Erikson's theories, Vygotsky's theories, Piaget's theories. There's a number of videos. Please check those out if you have not thus far. They will be important, and we will continue to revisit those theorists across the rest of our lifespan development portion of this course. So look at those. We're not going to spend, because we have limited time, we're not going to spend a lot of time on those or any time on those tonight, but please remember those and make sure you let me know if you have any questions or concerns about them. The one thing I will say about theories is you have an opportunity to figure out what resonates with you and what frame you will see lifespan development through. We offer many because it's not like they all agree with each other, but they do oftentimes build on each other. And especially one thing to connect the dots with is that when we're looking at all of the new brain science and what we know about the stress response and really just brain development in general, it actually does support, the theories are supported by what we now know about brain development. So it's very interesting that many of those theories, basically all of those theorists, were came along and did all the research decades ago, and way before we had things like fMRIs and all of the way to really see how children's brains are developing over time. And their theories and what we know about brain science, they really do go together, and are supportive of one another. So don't think about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. With those, they are still important, and you will definitely see those on things like your licensure exam and your comps a little bit. Okay, so jumping in, and please don't hesitate to stop me if you have any questions. I want to talk about poverty and brain development in children. So beginning with preschool and ending through childhood and beyond, poor children have lower academic achievement. We're going to dig into that a little bit, but I wanted to check in and see who could tell me how socioeconomic status, or SES, is associated with brain function. And what do we know about that based on what you all have learned thus far?
The lower the SES, kind of the less developed the brain is in certain sections, because they don't have access to what higher statuses would.
Can you give me some examples?
Like, I believe it was the frontal cortex isn't as developed, so when they get to school, they're more likely to act out because they can't plan and take direction as well as some of the other kids that have been enriched with certain toys and parents interacting with them and kind of helping them along in their development.
Good. So maybe a lot of that maybe that circle of security that was covered in the infancy unit last week, that may not be as fully as enriching. That whole circle may not be very wide, so maybe they're not getting a lot of exposure to different environments, different kinds of people, different kinds of toys, different kinds of playgrounds. Just simply may not be spending more time in front of the television. What's something that you all can tell me that is, what do we know that is kind of a central theme in anytime we're talking about impoverished environments or poverty in general? What is something that families and children experience who are growing up in poverty?
A lack of resources.
Yeah. So what might a lack of resources, what might that, how might the lack of resources impact parents?
If a mother has to work, it might take away from time where they could build the attachment bond between child and the caregiver, and so that would affect the plays into the socioeconomic status.
Right, because maybe if they're working 2-3 jobs to support their family, they may not be able to form that attachment with their child, and they child may be in a daycare setting during the day, and then maybe in some kinship care in the evenings, or even after school care if possible, and may have multiple different caregivers, but maybe they rotate. And so, because of course we can develop attachment with adults who are and caregivers who are not our biological parents, that's very possible, but you have to have some consistency there too. So if you're having lots of different daycare workers, maybe it's not a highly rated daycare, maybe the daycare itself doesn't have a lot of resources that can impact it too. So one of the things that was covered in previous unit on stress and trauma and hormones is this idea that poverty equals stress. Do you all remember that? So if we equate poverty and stress, what is stress? Can you all tell me what that is?
It's a biological response to environmental stimulus.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely it is. And if stress is a physiological response, so it's literally in our bodies and it's in our brain. And if poverty is stressful, or poverty, if you kind of equate those things, so every time you see the word poor or you see the word poverty and you understand that that's the environment you're talking about, and you equate that to a physiological response, how might that affect the developing brain of children? Do you remember from our stress unit how the brain responded when there was a stressful stimuli or there was a threat, essentially? Do you all remember what happened?
I know, like, overall, our body is, when it's stressed, it's kind of elevated. So everything that doesn't contribute to homeostasis kind of gets pushed to the back burner. So, like, brain development, emotions, that kind of gets cast aside to make sure that, we're just, that flight or fight response is taken care of. So when the kid's under constant stress, the brain doesn't develop to reach that extra level. It kind of just does the bare minimum of what is needed.
Yeah, and sometimes that means that we're going to have stronger synaptic connections with things that are stressful, because that's what we experience and that's what we get all the time. And that's actually going to rewire our brains in a certain way that they're not going to be wired in the same way where if we have healthy and secure attachments and then we're being raised in safe, stable, and nurturing environments. And so if you kind of are being faced with a tiger, essentially, or some, there's a lion in your, house all the time, so to speak, you are in that fight or flight response. And do we really need to learn math when there is a, tiger in our house or in our neighborhood? Are we going to be really able to concentrate on things like American history or English and where to put a comma, or remember what the teacher told us we were supposed to do with our backpacks when we got into the classroom in the morning? What do you all think? It's hard, right? We have things like, as Augusta was talking about, our non-essential functions are inhibited when we are chronically stressed and constantly under stress. And so things like our immune system is down, our prefrontal cortex and our executive functioning is compromised, our hippocampal volume even is lower. It's really, we're not making those connections with learning and memory. It's checked out. It's not really needed when we're constantly dealing with threat. So really, our whole entire system becomes dysregulated when, as young people, we experience adverse childhood experiences. Things like separation from a caregiver, everything that was covered under the ACEs material, parental mental illness, substance abuse, incarceration, all of those things have a profound effect on multiple levels. And it really does boil down to this whole idea that poverty equals stress. And when we're talking about brain development and poverty equals stress, and stress is going to inhibit our brain development as children. So if you can remember those things as you're moving forward, and especially as social workers, the implications are pretty clear. We are trained and designed to deal with vulnerable populations, and things like, and some of you mentioned this earlier around the kind of lack of resources. SES is related to health and health care and our access to prenatal care, access to having a pediatrician, getting regular checkups, can impact the presence of two parents in the home, the quality and resources that are available in our neighborhoods, our communities, our schools. Sometimes, as we've been talking about with epigenetics, there are some genetic factors that may come into play, and also parental education. is another factor that we may see. So you all have, we've kind of been talking about this, so I will scoot through it a little bit, but the effects on children's brains are not necessarily uniform, and there are individual differences that can come into play, like genetics, and also the type of environment and really where those lacks are. But we have seen that there is the biggest differences are around language and executive function. And there are no differences in that the research has found in the ability to delay gratification. And we're not going to watch them tonight, but there are a number of videos on the marshmallow test and looking at specifically children around the age of 4. If they are able to delay gratification at age 4, they have a host of very positive outcomes that are associated with that ability to essentially control themselves and manage their the intensity around their emotions with delaying gratification, and essentially saying, I can wait a few minutes and I'd rather have 2 marshmallows versus I'm going to ring this bell and I'm going to have 1 marshmallow right now because I can't stand looking at these marshmallows on my plate right now. And it's very interesting, but that, interestingly enough, is not, that's more of a temperament issue, and is not related to SES, at least the research has shown. So a little bit on executive function. It's loosely defined collection of brain processes which are responsible for planning, like someone mentioned earlier, the ability to kind of think ahead and plan, flexibility in making decisions, abstract thinking, which Piaget talked about the importance of that during middle childhood, role acquisition, initiating appropriate actions, and inhibiting inappropriate actions. And that kind of goes back to things like impulsivity and your ability to control yourselves. And selecting relevant sensory information, figuring out, what is most important for me to know. This is, our prefrontal cortex, remember, it's really the CEO of our brain and our ability to think abstractly and plan and really navigate the complex world in which we live. If we're constantly stressed, we're not really doing our best thinking. If we have lack of sleep, if we have poor nutrition, if we do not have healthy relationships with our primary caregivers, all of those things, which are often the case when children are raised in poverty, has a really remarkable impact on our executive function, and that you can actually see it in scans in your brain. You can see that those connections are not being made, they're being lost, they're being pruned away if they were there earlier and not reinforced. So it really makes a big difference. Poor children also show deficits in the parts of their brain related to working memory, cognitive control, and language. So why is we've talked about kind of learning and memory, but this whole thought about language, what kind of impact do you think that that has? Why is the acquisition of language in childhood important for development? What are some of the primary developmental tasks in early and middle childhood related to language?
If they don't learn language, they'll have poor communication skills. They'll be more or less likely to form more relationships that could help them in the future. And if they can't communicate, they could become more stressed and they could act out more if they don't have a development for language.
Yeah, absolutely. Language is critical in learning how to express your emotions in a healthy way. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Stephen. Language can also make it more difficult to express emotions. Absolutely. It really is an important, it's a really critical piece. Also, think about, especially once you get into middle childhood, your ability to express yourself verbally and, eventually in writing. It's, what do you do? What do kids do all day when they're not at home? They're in school, right? They're having to learn. They're having to interact socially with their peers. They're having to, obey the rules and learn rules through other adults that are not their parents. And language is really critical. So how well they do on tests and that they're able to essentially do well in school. And we'll talk more about the achievement gap in just a second here, but it really is a critical piece to the whole conversation around development. So I'm going to touch on just the differences in brain development, and specifically as it relates to stress for kids, and then we're going to jump to talking more about language. So remember that the brain development develops in a use-dependent way. So, it is a use it or lose it kind of deal. We start to see a lot more pruning take place after around age 6. All of those neural connections that might have been made when you were younger, they start to be pruned away, which of course is very normal, but it can become maladaptive if you are in these high stress environments that we're talking about, because things that you really might need, like learning and memory and language, can get pruned away. Neural systems, which is essentially saying neural systems that are activated repetitively are can change in permanent ways, and the way that brains change is really adaptive, and it can become maladaptive when it goes into kind of unhealthy or extreme ways. So there are 2 general types of adaptations when we're talking about either acute or chronic stress. And reflecting on Dr. Perry's work around child abuse, we talked a lot about the HPA axis and how it supports our fight or flight. The other part about the stress response is this whole idea of disassociation, which tends to be these are our freezers. So we've got, it is fight or flight, but it's also fight, flight, or freeze. And if you think about people who bears come and you kind of play possum and you drop down and play dead, you're really freezing. You're not fighting and you're not flying. So you're not in flight. So there is this whole other piece around dissociation. And this is important when you're really looking at kids. And one of the things, and you'll see this really comes into, you get into the DSM and certain pathologies, this will really come up, and you may even see this a little more often depending on what population of kids you're working with, or see this kind of manifest over time as an adult. Adults who have dissociative issues probably had those issues growing up. So the natural response to threat for young children is to use what they have. They're going to use the tools in their toolbox, which is to cry. But when crying doesn't work, they're going to give up. They're only going to try it for so long. And so essentially what happens is they, the behavior becomes extinct from disuse. And dissociation is the broad term for mental mechanisms that are used to disengage from the world and really focus on internal. So I kind of say the real technical way I think about this is you just check out. And you really can see this a lot of times with, really rich imaginations. If anybody who's seen the film Precious, which again, she's, much older than this, but, there's these, glorious examples of her just having this really rich, fantasy life, which is she's just essentially daydreaming all the time. She's in a really, really hard, very, very intensely stressful and traumatic place. And so she dissociates. And it's a very, can be very normal, can be very healthy just to kind of get you through the day to day, but it can become extremely maladaptive when there's no way to kind of bring you back. Because states can become traits. And if you remain in that disassociative state long enough, it can alter your HPA system. And especially around kids, you'll see a lot of somatic complaints. My head hurts, my tummy hurts, my arm hurts, my back hurts, things like that, which are essentially issues related to stress and trauma. And folks really can, you might see kids withdraw, you might see kids with high anxiety. And then also along this realm to, going into more kind of dependent or, feelings of helplessness. And eventually over time, those things can develop into more formal dissociative disorders. So a lot of those things that we'll see in, older adolescence or adulthood, they really do start early and can be tracked back. And also something else that to think about is how all of this relates to our inner working models. Because if let's say you have more externalizing behaviors and you have this, sorry, there's an ambulance you can probably hear. You have these behaviors that are more related to this fight or flight rather than this freeze or this disassociation, which is more internal. You may actually develop some confidence around this, and you may say, I've learned how to take care of myself, and don't mess with me. I can take care of myself because you've learned how to hit, you've learned how to fight back. Rather than if you're more dissociative, it can be a little bit more helpless, like I can't take care of myself. Feeling disengaged, really withdrawing from those around you. So it really can look many different ways, which is the last thing I want to touch on from these slides. Is one thing to think about with kids is that males are more likely to become hyper aroused and develop PTSD. This is not in any way, shape, or form saying that that females don't develop PTSD. It just simply has to do with the likelihood that they're going to have more externalizing behaviors. And females are more likely to develop these dissociative disorders. So things where they have a rich internal world, but you can kind of look at them and maybe think that nothing's wrong. But at the end of the day, they are still feeling very deeply, still having very intense emotions, but maybe doing things to numb out, maybe doing things like, this is where you can get into things like eating disorders, cutting, and other kind of behaviors. While those might sound external, but they really are, they're the kind of behaviors that you're not going to notice. And this whole idea about, externalizing versus internalizing is the thing to remember here is that boys tend to externalize those behaviors, yelling, screaming, kicking, hitting, tantruming, whereas girls may just really withdraw. Or maybe get more depressed, or they can still have high anxiety, but it's going to look different ways. You're also going to see those things why oftentimes, especially in the classroom, boys are going to come to the attention of teachers and parents with their issues a lot faster than girls, which is why you're going to see boys diagnosed with ADHD more, and you're going to see boys and adolescent males enter the juvenile justice system at higher rates than you will see with girls. And that's because of these externalizing behaviors. But really, I want you to remember both of those things can track back oftentimes to that same trauma, that same event. You could have child abuse, you could have neglect, you could have some other kind of maltreatment, sexual abuse, physical abuse, same thing, different behaviors. So you're going to get some variation in disorders. You're going to get some variation in interventions, of course. And things can look really, really different. So I am going to check in with you all for a second before I jump into a few more slides. Are there any questions about what we just covered? Any comments? Have you all seen this in your internships or in your previous work, or even at home, where you've seen some of these differences between how girls and boys respond to stress and trauma?
I'm working right now with children with behavioral problems, in a low income family, so I kind of get like curveballs from both areas. And right now we have a brother and sister, and it's interesting because she does internalize a lot more, whereas he acts out and he hits and he punches, and it's both a response from the same type of trauma, but you can see how differently they are, and they're close in age too. So it's pretty interesting to actually see it in person instead of in a textbook.
Yeah, yeah, that's good. It's good when things can get reinforced. And does anybody else have an example? All right. Well, y'all don't stop me. I mean, don't hesitate to stop me if you have any questions. Okay.
Oh, I couldn't find out how to unmute.
Oh, okay.
No, I have an immediate family member is a victim of sexual abuse, and a lot of the things which is traumatic, So a lot of the things that you mentioned about the behaviors, yeah, I mean, you can just see it playing out with that sort of like more reactive, whereas females that I've known dealing with similar things have a different manifestation of shame, or it seems to be more internalized. So that really resonated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good example. And you're reminding me too, this kind of goes back into learning a little bit, but sort of ties in is, shame and guilt. I don't know if y'all caught from the infancy unit, but children start to learn and experience and process shame, at very, very, very young ages, 2, 3, 4. So when you start that young, and especially if that doesn't get, if you don't have a real nice serve and return relationship, you don't have a good, healthy attachment, that really can go haywire, and those behaviors really can get internalized in a way that will be really different, as opposed to, boys who tend to externalize a little more. So it can be, there are a number of different ways that this can look. So I'm just gonna, all right, trying to keep up with the chats. Okay, so I'm going to jump into some more slides. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I haven't done this before, but I'm going to attempt to watch a little video while we're all together. But before I do so, I want to really kind of circle back around to this whole conversation around language acquisition, and and how it connects to poverty and SES. And our poverty rates really are going up and up and up, especially with the recession, and just don't seem to really be going much of anywhere. But several years ago, and we'll watch a little video on this, Hart and Risley did some pretty intensive longitudinal research and logged over 1,300 hours of observation of parent-child interactions with a number of different children of different socioeconomic statuses. And so 13 children in upper class families, 10 in middle class, 13 in lower class, and 6 on welfare. So, not a very high end for research, but very, very intensive number of hours. And we're going to watch this really, if this will work, we'll try it. We're going to watch a really brief video. It's only 2 minutes.
So it turns out, as many of you all know, I was not the first to notice these unfortunate differences. In fact, some 50 years earlier, researchers Betty Hart and Todd Risley, in the midst of the war on poverty, who were confronted by a similar dilemma, refused to accept the prevailing answer to the day as to why children from poor homes didn't do as well, which was, of course, the answer was genetics back then. Their landmark study helped me to understand that one of the critical forces in a child's ability to learn was his or her early language environment. Their study demonstrated that by the end of the age of 3, children born into poverty will have heard 30 million fewer words than their more affluent peers. But of course, quantity is only one part of the issue, as we all know. Quality plays a huge role. And in fact, even their study, which doesn't get much airtime, demonstrated huge differences in affirmations versus prohibitions. Don't do that, stop that. Differences in verbal back and forth, differences in quality of vocabulary. Often called the 30 million word gap or the word gap, these differences were correlated not only with vocabulary at the age of 3, but importantly, differences in test scores and IQ in the 3rd grade. In other words, how many words a child heard in their first 3 years of life and how they were spoken were critical factors in children's school readiness, catapulting some to the top and sending some to languish at the bottom. A division so prevalent and so expectable that we actually have a name for it, the achievement gap. But Hart and Risley's study and the enormous body of research that has followed has demonstrated that while on first glance, socioeconomic status appears to be the critical and only factor, in fact, after careful analysis, language plays a huge role in this.
So looking at this, and just kind of jumping into what this actually looks like, we talked about, and you've probably heard me say and read before, we think about development in terms of a trajectory. And so where kids start out at a certain time can be correlated to where they will end up based on a number of different variables and factors. And she just talked about language is one of those factors. And we've been talking about, SES and children raised in poverty and what that can look like. And so there is, there are major things that we can understand about kids who are raised in poverty, but this whole idea of language acquisition and the achievement gap has profound implications for how children can move through the world, and particularly our world, which is really based on social, academic, cultural expectations around around learning, around achieving, around reading. And when you think about this is in the millions. So just looking at this is 48 months. So by age 4, you've got this profound gap here between children who are raised in low income environments and children who are raised in professional environments, which is essentially based on education level of parents and occupation. So that's just an absolutely massive difference. And I want to hear from you all, why you think this is important when we're looking at development and just how this is going to impact kids.
The 2 things I took from that was it's not necessarily the amount of words they're learning. It's the fact that if they're hearing more words, that means the caregiver is spending more time with them. And then also, if they're hearing more words, it's more concepts they're learning,
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. And that whole idea of the interaction of the child, and it's this whole kind of, do this, don't do that. It's what's the quality of that interaction? How, going back to the circle of security, how wide is that circle? How many different experiences are they interacting with? If they have a very limited number of caregivers, those caregivers are going to tend to, speak the same way, might use shortcuts, may use less language, may not read, books to kids, may not have time to. It's one of the reasons we have the Dolly Parton Imagination Library here in Tennessee. For those of you who aren't in Tennessee, essentially all children, it doesn't matter about SES, but all children can register to read a book, receive a book for free every month of the child's life from the time they're born till they're 5. And the whole point is to get more it was kind of this is to get more language, more words in front of these kids to help them really be ready for school. And one of the things that they say as part of this Imagination Library program is that even if you don't know how to read as a parent, because we definitely still have parents who are illiterate or just have very low reading levels, is they just say sit with your child and read to your child and have a conversation, even if you can't read the words, because that interaction, that child-parent interaction, is so critical. And part of it is exactly this kind of word exposure and language exposure. So some of these documented disadvantages around this issue of children raised in poverty are poor academic achievement. And that's really because if you have a much lower exposure to words, you have a lower vocabulary, you're not going to do as well in school. You're not going to do as well on tests. You're going to have lower IQ scores, which means that you might get put into certain classes where you're not as exposed to as much. So it's really kind of this snowball effect. We know that children have poor physical health, poor mental health. We've talked about internalizing and externalizing problems, and things like conduct disorder and ADHD will show up. This is what this achievement gap that she referred to, this is what it looks like in terms of vocabulary. So we talked about the exposure and this kind of 30 million word gap. This is vocabulary. These are actually unique words. And it's, more than double. The vocabulary is more than double for professional families as it is for children who are raised on in welfare. And this is at 36 months, not even 48 months as the other graph. So it's the gap is real. The gap starts early. The gap is cumulative, and it's compounded by things like child abuse and neglect, poor attachment, poor nutrition. Remember, nutrition is very much related to myelination in our brain, and helps that the communication in our between synapses through those axons. Make sure that communication is efficient and fluid. So there's so many different things that are at play here.
And even Professor Steckel, in the research, one of the articles that we were reading this week talked about beyond the scope of the home, even in the school system,
yes,
how the teachers that these kids are exposed to, and I can't remember exactly what the variable was. I think it was teacher versus the other variable might have been teacher quality. So basically the research was saying that, you have this cycle of these kids coming from impoverished homes. Then they're placed in schools that don't have resources with teachers that are typically younger, because, a lot of these lower income schools are trying to get as many teachers as possible. So they're recruiting, those that are fresh out of college. So some of these teachers may not have a lot of experience, which all of these factors are continuing to impact the child's ability, to prosper in the academic environment.
Absolutely. And I think thank you for that. And I think that is a great segue into our conversation around the critical thinking exercise for this week. And, teachers are responsible for our children when they are, at school, outside of the home. That's where they spend most of their waking hours. And there are huge opportunities that teachers can have in a child's life. And they're oftentimes extremely overburdened, extremely underpaid, undereducated, undertrained to deal with children, educated and trained in a way that will better prepare them for dealing with children with complex needs, like our children growing up in poverty, like our children growing up with high ACE scores and, lots of adversity. We're not going to watch it in session together, but please, if you have not, because I think it'll really help with the CTE, watch the video that's under the folder on Blackboard that talks about the Head Start program in Kansas City And because it's such a beautiful example of how we can, address trauma right from the beginning. They have a whole Head Start program that is just for children. It's called Head Start Trauma Smart, and it's just for children who essentially have high ACE scores or even a few ACEs, but they're young, because Head Start is for our littles, for our young children, and before they go to kindergarten. And the whole thing is about teaching them how to feel safe and be safe so that they can actually learn. And it really does get them ready for kindergarten. And but a lot of the principles that they use are going to be effective and relevant for kids who haven't experienced trauma. It's things like how to regulate your emotions, how to regulate your mood, and really work through a lot of these issues. Yes, I agree. That was a totally awesome program. I'm reading the chat. Okay, so I would love to hear from you all. Speaking of the CTE, yeah, I think we're gonna get out of here. So I want to hear from you. What are some of the questions that you have and some of the core concepts that you all thought were important to cover in the CTE? And for those of you, I'm gonna read this real quick, because I know some of you are in the car and can't watch it, just to remember. It says, you are a school social worker and one of the teachers makes a remark about an active, impulsive African-American boy who lives in a poor and violent neighborhood, who has trouble sitting in his seat and is not learning very well. She says, that's typical. The other teachers nod their head in agreement. What would you include in a basic training that will help these teachers understand the boy's behavior without judgment? And there's many different ways that this may look, even if, the kind of idea behind this CTE, even if you don't work in a school, even if you're not a school social worker. So I'm curious, what did you all come up with initially?
One of the difficulties that I had initially was the assignment didn't specify how old this child was.
Yes. And
I thought that was pretty significant in figuring out which direction I wanted to go.
Yes.
So
So what I said, so thank you for bringing that up, and you may have jumped on after I said this, because I addressed this at the beginning, is because the age wasn't mentioned, you do have a lot of opportunity for just choosing or addressing it from the perspective of we might have modify the training program based on age, or at least address the training program, or at least the training program will need to address different developmental stages. So that's a very important piece of this. We are in the really in the portion of this course that really does deal specifically with ages. So addressing the age issue is important. You also can do it either way. You can focus on just early childhood. You could focus on just middle childhood. So you could do an early learning center or an elementary school. It could look, it really could look kind of any way that you want it to look. There's no right or wrong issue, except for probably not dealing with appropriate developmental stages. That would be important. Does that help?
yes.
Okay, great. Are there any other initial questions, or anybody want to jump in about kind of what your frame was for this? You really did have some fantastic CTEs the first time around, so I'm excited to read this one, but I know it is a little bit different because it doesn't kind of spell everything out for you the way that the first one did. I'd be happy to call on people. Hey, Sally.
Hi.
Hey.
So the approach I took on the latter part of my CTE was about approaches to mediate or mitigate some of these home life stressors. And I pulled some information about mindfulness training.
Yeah.
And the positive and the research that's been done and the results that they're seeing. But that was elementary age and middle school and high school. They're seeing it or kind of across the board. But something I was trying to squeeze in but didn't really get to was about the benefit to the teacher and how her stress level can be lessened too, if that was part of some of the articles I pulled. But I guess the theme that I was hoping to wrap up is that just getting these teachers to realize that it's not just a child being difficult, or defiant, that there are physical things going on because of their home life and their environment that are showing up at school, and empathy and operating with empathy. So.
Absolutely. Sally, thank you. Yes, absolutely. It's so, and I think that's why I wanted to put this in such simple terms this week around, poverty equals stress. Stress is a physiological response. So, which means that through living in poverty, and especially if you overlay violence, that equals a physiological response. Our kids have a physiological response to their socioeconomic status. So, and they're not, unless they learn tools, like you're saying, mindfulness, it's going to be really hard for them to learn. And I think the other piece, talking about, teachers, and maybe y'all let me know if any of you covered this, is that teachers have a role, and sometimes they can feel really overwhelmed because they've got 20 kids, and then they've got a handful over here that are acting out, but they have a whole classroom. How do they manage that classroom? And realizing that they may be that one supportive adult that can completely change the trajectory of that child's life. No pressure, right? No pressure. So it can be really daunting, but it's also important so that helping instill, like you're saying, empathy, but also kind of mitigating this feeling of helplessness or powerlessness over the situation, is that teachers really do have a role to play there. So great, Sally, thank you. Anybody else want to share?
With my CTE, I didn't expressly, I guess I was thinking younger, but I didn't expressly say that in the paper in the CTE, but I chose to kind of focus it from that all children have potential, but is that environment, enriching enough to express that potential? And kind of what you said a minute ago, how the teacher kind of works to offset any of the home life issues, and that, children, we've got to give them the kind of benefit of the doubt that they may that they may have the, the potential. We just have to foster it. Absolutely.
They're not necessarily a blank slate, but there's so much that they can do. Yes, absolutely. It's really important to, for folks to understand the impact that they can have and really engender that and support that potential. We talked about in the ACEs unit, this whole idea of, and essentially this little boy in our example, he's got some ACEs, and looking at how to mitigate those is really important. And one of the ways we do that is through safe, stable, and nurturing environments. So our school can be safe, stable, and nurturing, or it can be like a jungle, you're dealing with all these threats and tigers, lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, and figuring out, how do these kids navigate this? So there's lots of opportunity here. So let's hear from somebody else.
I'll share.
Sure.
Yeah, it took me back to Unit 3, the stress. So I was kind of revisiting that average childhood experience, and the training I thought would just kind of like, who's the first first person you shared, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Sally.
Sally. Talked about, I don't know if compassion was the word she used, empathy, I think, just kind of painting the picture for the teachers of it is physiological, chemical, there are effects going on in the brain of these children that they can't control. So just explaining that, and then speaking to the, like you said, teachers and also parents, their role in being a part of the solution, and just what that could look like. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I think that's good. And I think reinforcing, if you've got an issue that is physiological, then can we have an intervention that is also physiological? So we can have these kind of top-down, bottom-up approaches to dealing with stress. And like Sally talked about with mindfulness, that would be considered a bottom-up. That's our body figuring out how to control itself, and figuring out how can we actually calm our stress response system down. So, taking those deep breaths, doing those counting exercising, having calm down boxes like they talked about in the
yeah, that was a cool video.
Yeah, there's so many. And then again, you saw the dad. It's such a great example. You had all these things that she was learning in therapy, things she was learning at school, or in Head Start, and then they were being reinforced by her dad at home. So, and then guess what? It's like magic. That little girl that they highlighted, her tantrums, went away. She kind of got back to her old self after the really adverse event, and was able to really, learn and grow and be happy, and really kind of get back to being a kid, because she found a way, kind of this bottom up way. She was kind of practicing mindfulness to a certain degree, maybe didn't call it that, but she was learning how to regulate her emotions, and it's absolutely critical. That's why we talk about healthy social emotional development. It's about regulating those emotions. And you're right, teachers just simply may not be attuned to that, or like someone said earlier, may not have the education or the wherewithal to understand everything that these kids are dealing with. So good. We have any other volunteers? Y'all are all volunteers because you go to UT, even if you don't live in Tennessee. So what are some other examples or different frames that you all focused on? Did anybody cover this issue about implicit bias? Did anybody look at that from the PBS, or I can't remember if it's PBS or NPR article that talked about how teachers interpret behavior based on race, which is kind of one of the big issues that's covered here in the CTE. And maybe something to consider. I know you all have written your CTEs by now, but and I think it's really, it can be it's important to be thoughtful about how we talk about that. But I really encourage all of you. I encourage everybody, not just social workers, but everybody to take that assessment and see. It's available online. And see where you land on it personally, because it's important to know what biases you may have and not even know about it. But essentially, one of the things is that we see what we look for. So if and kind of what you expect. So if that's kind of reflects on this whole comment around, oh well, that's typical, and it kind of implies that kid is a bad kid, or that we would expect, because they're African American and come from a poor, and violent neighborhood, that they're going to act a certain way, where really, there could be a number of different things. The students in my class today who talked about the CTE, my face-to-face class, one of them brought up this idea of, let's understand what the appropriate developmental tasks are, and things like, maybe they're acting out because they can't hear. Maybe there's a sensory disorder. Maybe they are getting up because they can't see, or there's, something else going on that you would want to screen and assess for, and making sure that we're not making assumptions just because, they have these certain variables going on. And really going back to that social work value of meeting people where they are. We kind of say meet clients where they are, but, understanding, figuring out, what are the unique needs of that child. So there are some different angles that you could take with this, and you do have some creative freedom, as I mentioned before. So what are some other frames that you all talked about? I've heard mindfulness. I've heard encouraging potential, mitigating stress. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, looking at the quality of that relationship between the teacher and those kids is really, really important. And like on that one video, even just looking at the whole school, how is the lunch lady interacting with kids? How is the bus driver interacting with kids? There's so many opportunities for to really advance this whole, trauma-informed care, and help, really help kids, feel safe, learn how to calm their bodies down so that they can actually learn, which is, of course, what teachers want. So there's lots of opportunity here. Trying to see if I'm going to call on somebody. Are there any general questions about the CTE format? Any other kind of housekeeping? We have more people on now than we're on earlier. Any kind of housekeeping questions about the CTE?
Stephen's comment in the comment section that's kind of where I went with my CTE. I didn't specifically look at it from any approach other than the environmental factors of that. So I don't know. It makes me a little nervous now.
Yeah, no, I think it's okay. I think it's, for those who can't see Stephen's question, great question, Stephen. He talked about, the interplay of low socioeconomic and environmental risks, and, kind of saying, okay, well, how do I incorporate the developmental stages? And I think that you don't necessarily have to go, stage by stage. Erickson said this and Piaget said, I don't think you need to get in that. But basically, we can't. It's hard for us to understand, what's significant or abnormal or maladaptive if we don't also first understand what is, expected. So I think just having, a brief touch on, if you can, or at least in a way where it's implied, because, teachers just simply may not know about the language gap or, just the different pieces. So I think depending on, it's kind of hard to answer that because it's sort of like, depending on your frame, it may make more or less sense. But I think in general, so don't freak out if you haven't covered developmental stages. And I know I said that earlier, so let me try to be as clear as possible. I think as long as you have some sense in a training, and think about this from the perspective of what would you want to know as a teacher? If you were going through this training, what would be helpful for you to know? And, understanding the basics, whether it's developmental stages or not, it's really what I mean by that is, what's typical brain development, and why do we care about brain development when we're talking about stress, or we're talking about behavior that is, what is he doing? He is, not sitting in his seat, and he's not learning very well. So he's kind of not able to control his body and sit still, probably because he doesn't feel very safe. One could consider, and he's not learning very well, probably because, his hippocampus is just simply offline. So that's the kind of the part about development that you could interject. Yeah. So, okay, good. All right, glad I helped. Okay, I'm reading the chat. So discussion around how the lack of critical needs can affect a child overall, and therefore affect their learning and behavior. Yeah. So if your needs aren't being met, it can be really rough. One of my favorite memes I've ever seen was a cartoon, actually, a couple of years ago, had a picture of this kid. It's sort of like the stressed baby from a couple units ago. But it was a kid, and he was walking into school, and he had this backpack, and there was all this stuff in his backpack, like didn't sleep last night, didn't get to eat this morning, mom and dad were fighting, all of the, I was bullied on the way to school. It was like all of these different things. And then it's like, okay, you're expected to be on time for your math class and sit here and learn about all this stuff. So if you can communicate, to teachers that there's this whole, baggage that all of these kids come in with, and figuring out, you've got to acknowledge and figure out, how can you get their physiological stress response down so that they can actually learn. And then at the same time addressing that, this is a real thing. This is not made up. This does not make these kids, any less human, or shouldn't be valued any less. And I think some of that's implied a little bit, which is why the whole conversation around just what is normal, what can we expect from all children, and when does that become an issue. So another thing that some of you all may talked about is just how resilient children are, and there's a whole conversation in Dr. Comstorm's slides around resiliency. There's some great videos. We didn't get to talk about that in too much detail tonight, but there's it's another huge kind of piece of the puzzle. Is we talk about all these negative things. We talked about ACEs and maladaptive behaviors and all this kind of stuff, pathologies in childhood and effects of poverty on the brain. But it also, these things truly can be mitigated, and they can potentially be mitigated by healthy relationships with one caring adult. Having at least one person know, four is better, but having at least one person know, or the child have at least one person that they know loves and cares about them, and can make all the difference in the world, all the way down to the neural connections in our brain and what our brain architecture looks like. So there's lots to consider. I look at these, you probably figured this out from your grade, but I look at these individually. So, it's just kind of important to be organized and to kind of have your point, have your frame, and then support it with the evidence. And for those of you who didn't hear me say this before, it is acceptable to use articles from different units. You can cite videos, you can cite PowerPoints, you can cite the text. Just make sure you do all that in APA format. And also, don't forget that it's best to definitely rely on the research articles, even if you go and get some of your own, but just, keep a balance. So don't, overly cite the PowerPoints or overly cite the videos and things like that. But, having one is okay. But you should rely on those journal articles. So I'm reading one of these. Okay, I'll have to figure out how to write to you. If you have any questions, because this chat's going to go away as soon as I end the meeting. If you have any questions between now, I'll just try. I'll be at work for another hour or so. Feel free to email me something separately. I'll be happy to answer your question before you submit these later tonight. But are there any final parting thoughts, words of wisdom from your peers? Are y'all super happy that you made it through neuro? Can you believe it? You made it through neuro. You made it through neuro. You did it. I told you could do it. Y'all thought I was kidding. I know you didn't believe me, but you did it, and I'm proud of you. I said this again. I'll just say it one more time. Is y'all really had some phenomenal CTEs, and I continue to be so impressed by all of you, by our online students. You make me proud. Make it easy on me when you submit such awesome CTEs. So look forward to reading these. I should have them graded another 2 weeks or so. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions, any problems with Blackboard, any issues with anything at all, or if you just want to chat. I would love to hear from you. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up for tonight if there is nothing else. But I appreciate your participation and look forward to reading your CTEs. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.